Hi everyone, and it's Amanda Stott again, and this week the topic is legal issues and medication administration. So the objectives for this week, after engaging in this module material, listening to the lecture, participating in your tutorial, either face-to-face, listening to it online, you should be aware of the legislation or the law pertaining to the administration of drugs, understand the regulation of drug administration, including storage and recording practices, have an awareness of the factors that contribute to making a drug error, and be familiar or have familiarity with criminal and professional issues in relation to drug administration. So, moving along, one of the major roles or duties you undertake as a nurse is the administration of drugs. And research has shown that nurses can spend up to 40% of their working shift administering and handling drugs. So it is extremely necessary that you have an understanding of the legal framework that surrounds this practice, because it goes without saying that most of the drugs, or in other words poisons, you will be handling have the potential to be extremely dangerous, and you need to be very careful in your handling, documentation, storage and administration practices. Throughout the subject, I've been impressing on you the importance of adhering to policy guidelines, because again that articulates the law, and I think the area of medicines, handling medicines and drug administration, it is particularly relevant. This area of health practice can have the potential to place nurses open to legal liability, for example in the case of professional misconduct, where in terms of misappropriation of drugs, incorrect handling and storage or stealing drugs, but also in unsatisfactory professional conduct where you breach your duty of care in that you don't meet standards by cutting corners, and you might give the wrong drug by the wrong route at the wrong time, and consequently that may well result in a civil suit should the patient become harmed and then seek compensation for that. So goes without saying that very, very important, and it's well worth reading very clearly the chapter for this. Now the law or the legislation or the statute that surrounds our practice in this area is the Poisons and Therapeutic Goods Act for 1966, and again we'll talk about this in a minute in terms of how we articulate it. It would be unlikely that you would refer to that actual act or statute on a day-to-day basis, but what you will definitely be referring to, and one of the things we're going to get you to do in your tutorials and make sure you're very, very familiar with it, is the policy relating to medication handling in New South Wales public hospitals. Remember that these policy directives or these policy documents articulate the actual regulations that accompany the statute. So very, very important. Among other things, the Act sets out the specific responsibilities for professionals involved in the handling, storage and administration of drugs, and is something you need to be readily aware of no matter what state you work in. There's a lot of similarities between states and territories. There might be a few differences, and that's when, for example, if you're a nurse and you're working in Victoria, and you're a Div 2, for example, you're allowed to handle S8 medications, where in New South Wales you are not. So it is a good practice that should you be transient in your practice, say you go to WA or Queensland, always to familiarise yourself with the policy and the legislative framework of that state and or territory. As I've said, each state and territory of Australia has specific legislation covering control of poisons, and it can get a little confusing in terms of understanding that legislation relating to handling drugs. I think the main thing to be aware of is you derive certain information from different sections. For example, you'll not find information regarding the handling and storage of drugs within the actual statute or act itself. You need to look at the regulations that accompany that act, and which are always detailed separately. But in relation to you as the nurse, the regulations, which are the most important part of the legislation pertaining to poisons, it's spelled out for you in your policy directives, your medication handling in New South Wales public hospitals, and I'll actually do a screenshot of that document in a little minute. But just a little bit more on the legislation, just a couple of things to be aware of. Poisons are divided up into different schedules, and the template for dividing them up into those different schedules is the SUSMP. Now, it's actually up to number 17 at this point in time, and what that stands for is the Standard for the Uniform Scheduling of Medicines and Poisons. It's essentially a national classification system that controls how medicines and poisons are made available to the public, and they're really classified according to the level of control and availability. So it's all about protection of the public, and so we'll talk about this in the other little mini lecture, but the schedules that are really relevant to nurses, of course, are S2s, S4s, S4Ds, and S8s. And the higher the classification, the more restricted they are. And I think the main thing to be aware of is, from a departmental circular point of view, schedules on poisons can change from time to time, and one that has been fairly recently changed and is the drug prazolam, which was always classified as a Schedule 4 poison, but has been very recently, or fairly recently, in the last 2-3 years, upscheduled to an S8 poison, and that's because it is one of those that has been becoming misused, and again, it's about protecting the public and trying to restrict it. Prazolam, you might know it as the trade name Xanax. So again, it's become a street drug essentially, and so they've upscheduled that. So just bear with me. We're now going to look at the information repository that, as a nurse, no matter what state or territory you work in, you'll be very familiar. It's the policy directive about handling medication, and we're going to look at the one for New South Wales, and we'll look at specific information that is contained in that document. So as I've just mentioned, I've spoken about the legislation that governs our practice, or the law, and that's the Poisons and Therapeutic Goods Act. And as I say, each state and territory has their own legislation. A lot of similarities, but there might be the odd difference, so you've always got to check wherever you're working. You won't get information about how to store drugs. That is recorded separately in the regulations that accompany those acts. How that is filtered down in terms of very straightforward information is contained in our policy documents. So the one that you really need to be aware of is this one here. So we'll just broaden the screen. It's the medication handling in New South Wales public health facilities. And of course, during your tutorials and your worksheets that you need to complete, you have a number of questions that you are given. So if there's one document that I say is particularly relevant to you, because these are the guidelines, the rules the regulations that clearly articulate your standards for practice in relation to giving out medications. All right, and everything is covered here. Now, the area that I will take you to is administering medication, section 7. So that's the one that you really need to familiarise yourself. They're administering from a verbal telephone, what are standing orders, second person checks, discarding partly used Schedule 8, restricted substances, and so on. All of it's there. All right, particularly 7.6, the principles for safe medication administration. So in your clinical subjects or your workplace learning, you are learning those principles. But if you ever need to refresh or ensure that you know the standards, you know where to come. On the New South Wales Health site, it is that policy document.